My PowerPoint presentation is a comparison of the Roman Empire and the East Asian empires. I am focusing on the Qin and Han dynasty in particular. In this presentation, I will not only be discussing the contrasting features of these two civilizations, but what a great civilization looks like, as well as the ways the 21st century ideas differ. To start, I think it is important to discuss what makes a civilization great. I believe the most important factor is some type of leadership or governing body over the people. This leads to organization and ultimately sets up a civilization for success. Next, any great civilization needs military to defend and conquer to continue the safety and growth of the nation. Having a food source or a way to gain access to food is very important to keep the civilization populated, and we have seen in our reading that when food sources are scarce, people will leave. Education and communication with the people are also very important to help grow the community. Without communication and expectations being shared, there is anarchy. Education is important, especially when it comes to trading goods. It is with these trades that civilization bring income and sources of money. Trade and merchants are important because without commerce of some kind, a civilization has nothing to barter with other civilizations. Starting my presentation of great civilizations, first to be mentioned is East Asia, especially China. There have been known dynasties since 1500 BCE, starting with the Shang dynasty. With these different dynasties have come many wars and different politics that have changed and shaped China for what it is today. I personally have decided to use the time periods of the Qin and Han dynasty, which go hand in hand. The Qin dynasty finally brought unification to China after the Warring States. While it wasn't long-lasting, the Han dynasty continued to unify China until they were overthrown by the increasing number of non-Chinese people and was known as the Age of Division. During the Qin dynasty, unification of the Chinese Empire, while short-lived, is worth mentioning with the Han dynasty. The first emperor was able to bring legalist policies and standardized laws to bring his citizens together. In his time, he managed to build roads, which led to an increase in trade and would set up the success for the Han dynasty in the Silk Road. The first emperor's main concern was protection from above the northern border from the nomadic Xiongnu. He is the one who managed to build the Great Wall as it still stands today. Lastly, the standardization of script was implemented and it connected all this dynasty together. After the collapse of the Qin dynasty, the first emperor for Han dynasty was Emperor Gaozhou. He came from modest means, and so his first decision was not to disband the centralized government, but to reduce the harsh laws and taxes imposed before him. While the Qin dynasty relied heavily on legalism, the Han dynasty preferred Confucianism, and even though many books were burned during the Qin time, the few surviving texts were recovered and turned into what historians now know as the Confucian classics. During the late 3rd century, the military of the Han dynasty showed its advanced prowess, and Emperor Wu managed to expand his military to find allies. The expansion of Central Asia was known as the Silk Road. Due to the financial hardships of the continuing war with the Xiongnu, the Emperor of Han tried to implement a tributary system in which gifts were exchanged with foreign powers. This exchange would help keep the Han dynasty financially stable and contributed 10% of the revenue for the state. The Han dynasty also began to increase their craftsmanship and trades. There was trading along the Silk Road, everything from silk, gold, animals, and foodstuffs such as walnuts, sesame, and coriander that would eventually be planted and grown in China. The craftsmanship and sales within the capital became festive and offered not just market sales but entertainment. The reason for the success of this civilization, besides trade, was the fact that the bulk of the population were farmers. This was made possible to continue due to low taxes, promoting up-to-date agricultural methods, and encouraging migration to new lands that could be farmed. The Roman Empire began with kings, and it wasn't until the 6th century that the Romans established a form of government, which was the Senate. The Senate was run primarily by aristocrats when first established, but after enough plebeians voiced their concerns, this led to the struggle of order. This struggle of order allowed for the laws, which were only known by aristocrats or patricians, to be published into the laws of 12 tables, and allowed for elections of plebeians into their own tribunes that could bring grievances to the Senate. They were also well known for civil law, which was used to regulate the lives of citizens, especially the ones who owned property. Their criminal law, on the other hand, was seen as harsh and based their law on what they called natural law, which was rules that come from reasons rather than tradition. The Romans were known for their strong military prowess. They were conquerors, and it was their organization and manpower that allowed for them to bring most of Italy under their influence by 265 BCE. Once conquered, the Romans would build roads, and it helped to keep the flow of communication, trade, and the armies to be easily traveled throughout. They had strong religious beliefs in their early times, which was polytheist, or known as pagan, and praised their many gods for battles won. The Romans were also believers of Judaism, and it wasn't until Emperor Tiberius was in power that Jesus of Nazareth started to preach the word of God and was labeled the Messiah. This was the start of Christianity. The reason I chose the two civilizations I did was because their timelines were around the same as each other. Both civilizations had a form of leadership. While the Chinese utilized legalism and then ultimately centralized government, the Romans were made up of a senate of aristocrats and considered the first republic. The Romans were known to be the first civilization to promote civil law, but were very harsh when it came to punishments of crime, while the Qin dynasty initially were very harsh and cruel with punishment, and then became laxer under Emperor Gaozud. And at no point were there proceedings in regarding to civil complaints. Religiously for this time, the Qin dynasty believed in legalism to such an extent that they burned all text of anything else. It wasn't until the Han dynasty overthrew the Qin leaders Confucian became the main belief for the civilization, and even evolved over time. The Romans, on the other hand, were mostly pagan and Jewish, and later Christianity was founded with Jesus. Another contrast between the nations was their military strategies. While both had very strong military behind them, the Qin dynasty defended its border with the Great Wall, and the Han dynasty expanded its territory by establishing military colonies and finding allies. While the strategy worked for the Han in pushing back Xiongnu tribes, the allies were never made into citizens, and that was what eventually overthrew the dynasty. In comparison, the Roman Empire conquered the lands that surrounded them. Once overthrown, they allowed the people among those remaining to become citizens with the elite and other citizenship without the right to vote or hold office. These citizens then were able to be utilized for military if the need arose. Lastly, the influence of trade was vastly different. While both had strong trade routes within their civilization, the Romans were considered to be more influential and diverse, utilizing the conquered areas for trade. While the Han Dynasty trade was just trade for goods, the Silk Road helped open up opportunity for a tributary system. Both utilized trade to continue to grow their civilizations and to provide goods needed to strengthen their governments. While there were similarities of greatness, there were also many differing ideas from the 21st century. One of the biggest differing ideas was slavery and the expectation that work would be done with no compensation by men, women, and children, and they would remain slaves until their death. Another huge difference was warring with the territories around them to expand their civilization and conquer. Also, the separation of religion and government is something that has changed drastically since this time period. Gender equality and the allowing of women to not only be seen as citizens, but contributing members of society also is a big difference. Education is expected of all people, including children of both sexes. Lastly, with all the advancements we have made, the differing of jobs and diversity. While this may be circumstantial because of the growth, in my research it seemed there were set roles that trying to branch out was often frowned upon. It was expected that merchants were to trade, farmers would grow food, men and slaves would be in military, and aristocrats would run the government, while it is possible today for anyone to be anything they want. In conclusion, it is safe to say that the 21st century ideas of greatness had some similarities and differences. It is clear that both the Han and Qin dynasty, as well as the Roman Empire, had many strengths that made both great civilizations, and they also had many differences, but each had impacts that would remain even today. Their impact made history and will continue to be learned for centuries to come.